Again, it's hard to bring the whole atmosphere of General Conference back to you, but thank you to the four of you who did present this morning. Especially hope that you, as a congregation, will take some time to thank Jim and Bill for attending General Conference on your behalf. Pastor Holly and I had to go. I mean, we're ordained clergy. I wanted to go too. I want to make sure that's clear, but we have to go. Lisa and Rob, our spouses, that's just free choice. But then Jim and Bill, well, both these guys went entirely on your behalf and in your name to represent our church at General Conference, to report about General Conference back to us as a church. As such, on the first summer-long weekend, when many of you were planting gardens or spring cleaning around the house or opening up your cottage or partying with friends or enjoying family or maybe just sleeping in a little, Jim and Bill went to bed late. They were early to rise. Sessions began at 8 a.m. and official duties were done around 10 p.m. That's a 14-hour workday in case you're having trouble with the math on that one. Their time is not compensated. They gave it all to the Lord on behalf of our church. And so Jim and Bill each have invested themselves, giving up an entire weekend to serve their church. So I hope you take time, especially to thank them for going this morning. I also want to say thanks quickly to three people who made our departure possible during our absence. Chris Ellis preached in my place. I saw him here this morning. He must be down with the kids, I guess, hey? So I've heard that he did a great job, as I knew he would. It's daunting to be asked to do something outside of your area of expertise, but when I presented my request to Chris, he mulled it over only for a minute or two and then said yes. As a Christian person, I know that Christ often calls us to do just a little bit more than we think we can do on our own strength. And I know that Jesus has called me beyond my comfort zone many hundreds of times in my life. And then as a pastor, I get to watch him do that in others, and I get to see them succeed. Not succeed in terms of the spotlight shines on themselves. You know what I mean? Don't mean that, right? But succeed in putting forth great effort for Christ, honoring Him in their work. So thank you to Chris for stepping up and serving our church in that way, that we could go to conference. And then Mark DePlock, he also took on a new role. He led the service that week while many of our upfront regulars were away. His testimony to me afterward was that until you have to be in charge, you're not really aware of all the work that goes into preparing a Sunday morning week by week. But Mark is an organized guy, and he did his homework ahead of time, and he served our church well. And even though Cindy Jardin has been up front multiple times in multiple ways, she took lead of the kids' corner and freed up Pastor Holly to be able to go to conference. So thank you to those who stayed behind and picked up other responsibilities. Now, the core issue our denomination faces, I think, and what I was hearing a lot at General Conference, the number one discussion point for us was summed up in our post-conference meeting. Pastor Holly and Jim and Bill and myself, we all met this past week to talk about our conference experience, to debrief what we learned, to think about what we were going to tell and present to you this morning. And Bill made the comment, which all of us agreed with, that the next team we send to General Conference in 3 years from now, the next team we send to General Conference ought to be much younger than the team we sent this time. This is an issue not unique to our church. We face it. Our denomination faces it, and all of the whole church in Canada faces it. The average age of Christians is not growing any younger. Therefore, we need to be intentional about engaging and inspiring upcoming generations. We've looked at the facts and found that the average age of our pastors is just over 50 years old. We have a whole bunch of pastors who are set to retire in the next 5 years. More are set to retire in the next few years than are coming up behind them as ordinands. Now, I'm not sure we want a whole swath of very young pastors, but at 50 years old, you are generally over half done your career. To use a small play on words, over half our pastors are over half done their ministry career. Yeah, I think that adds up. That's on the denominational level. In local churches, we're finding that much of our volunteer pool is well on into retirement. And the number of younger adults in our churches has not only dwindled through the years, but the ones who remain live ultra-busy lives. The issue is not really about age, of course. Rather, it's an issue of succession planning. How do we build for the future? If we look at these trends, we have to face a tough question. Why are more young people not involved in the church? And it's a mix of two not very fun answers. On the one hand, perhaps we've not done a good job of inviting young people into church leadership. That's one possible answer. They're not involved because maybe we didn't invite them. And another possibility is that we invited them, but they said no. Wherever the failing, the reality is beginning to dawn on us in new ways. We're going to have to be intentional about inspiring our young people to love Jesus and invest in His church. I can't help but think about the Apostle Paul on this topic. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 to 7, as Patty read for us earlier, here's the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy. He says this, "I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now, I am sure, dwells in you also. For this reason, I remind you to," and you've heard this phrase before, "I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and of self-control." Here, Paul is writing to a young man named Timothy. How young was Timothy? Well, we don't know, but he was old enough to be in charge of full leadership of a group of adults, so he was at least in his 20s, maybe in his 30s. Now, why would Paul instruct this young man? Well, it's mentorship, right? Just like any industry in this world, the elder one teaches the younger ones, right? Paul is an apostle, having himself seen Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Timothy is the younger one. Examples in society abound. A teacher teaches the students. A journeyman has an apprentice. Many colleges and universities now arrange work placements for their students. Almost any mid or large-sized company has internships. And even our fiction has this pairing, as a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Jedi Knights would have Padawan learners. There's me reaching to the younger generation, right? The mentor-mentee relationship, is that a word, mentee? You know what I mean if I use it? Okay. The mentor-mentee relationship, it's well established in our world. Of course, Paul the apostle would look for a young pastor to shepherd the churches he would establish. Paul would want to look for the next generation, except what took him so long to do so? If you have one of those study Bibles, or if you look in a commentary set, you will notice that the New Testament books of 1st and 2nd Timothy, and also the book of Titus, are a particular kind of literature. They're called epistles. That means they're a letter from one person to another. But these three documents are called the pastoral epistles. They get that special name because they are letters from Paul to these two young men who are being specifically trained for church leadership and leading the church into the next generation. But if you look further into your study notes, further into your commentary sets, you will notice that these letters were written in about the year AD 65. Why is that important? Because it means that Paul didn't look for a ministry successor until more than 30 years after the ascension of Jesus. In other words, there was the event of Jesus' death and resurrection, and then he visited the apostles for the next 40 days and gave them the speech known as the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations, and I will be with you till the end of the age. And then he went up into heaven in the ascension. And then for the next 30 plus years, the apostle went about doing just that, making disciples with a sense of urgency, traveling to this town and that part of the world, telling people about Jesus. Making disciples like there's no tomorrow because they thought there might not be. Jesus' promise was that one day he would return, and they figured it meant within their lifetime. In fact, as the years wore on, Paul had to wrap his head around the idea of a long history church rather than a short history church. As the Christian relatives of Christian people began to die, their families wondered what would become of these loved ones of ours. My uncle was a believer, my grandfather was a believer, my sister was a believer, and now he or she is dead, but Jesus has not come back yet. How can they be part of his kingdom if he hasn't returned? And Paul had to assure them. Maybe he was even trying to assure himself. They are fine. Their eternity is secure. The God who resurrected Jesus will also resurrect your loved ones into eternal life. But it took years before the Apostle Paul or any of the church leadership began to take seriously the notion that a plan for the future was necessary. The stories of Jesus, the content of the New Testament of the Bible, that stuff wasn't written down for several years. They never thought they'd have to. They figured Jesus was coming back so soon that going to the expense of writing books was unnecessary. Churches met in people's homes. They never thought about building buildings. They would not be needed if Jesus' return was imminent. And who could take the time to train up new leaders? The apostles could tell Jesus' story just fine. But then 30 years down the road, when the apostles were older, and some of them were being killed by the persecution, and the initial generation of eyewitnesses to Jesus were beginning to die out, a plan to train future leaders became obviously necessary. And so no less than the Apostle Paul himself takes the young man, Timothy, under his wing, and Titus too. And he would train them. Train them not to simply be good and nice Christian people who love their neighbor. Paul taught this young man, Timothy, and this other young man, Titus, to be leaders in the church. Do not be intimidated because you are young, but teach all of the church in confidence of the call and giftings that the Spirit has given you, he told them. Combat false teaching, encourage godliness, teach other men, teach women, teach children, teach them all to be devoted fully to Jesus. To these young men, Paul charged them, preach the word, be ready in and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. Always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. And in perhaps one of the most known string of words in the entire New Testament, Paul urges Timothy in our passage this morning, verse 6, to fan into flame the gift of God that is put in you by the laying on of my hands. The church needs to make an impassioned call, as direct and strongly worded as Paul was to his young protege. The church needs to issue that kind of challenge to its young people. And the young people need to rise up to the challenge. On the Saturday night of General Conference, I watched a mentor of mine retire after 20 years as bishop. Over 40 years total time in ministry, including his time as pastor. Now, he is not a mentor of mine in terms of we had coffee together every week or anything, but I watched his ministry from afar and sometimes up close as we served on denominational committees together. And I've grown by learning from his example. But Bishop Keith and those of his generation are retiring. And these giants of the faith are leaving big shoes to fill. And they need to turn to the next generation and the one coming after that. They've asked me to be on the board of administration. And that's a committee of our denomination that meets twice per year to carry forward the goals of our General Conference. At a time of much uncertainty, the easiest thing for me to have done would be say, no, I don't want to. I can't do it. I don't have time. It doesn't fit my schedule. We're facing a complex ministry context here in Canada. We're wondering how to resource churches and pastors in this modern world. We have 2 national leadership team director seats open right now. Will we fill them or will we rearrange job descriptions? We have a new bishop. What ideas and dreams will he bring to the table? A lot of things are up in the air. It's not going to be easy to sit on the board of administration. The easy thing to do would be say, no, I'm not going to do that. Find somebody else. But here's the thing. If I say no, if my generation says no, then who will? If you're in your 40s or 30s or 20s, you need to know this. You might already know it, but if you're in your 40s or 30s or 20s, then you're not the future of the church. You are the present of the church. The leadership mantle has to fall on your shoulders. Not mere task-oriented volunteerism, but direction-setting dreams of where the church will go today and tomorrow. You need to reimagine ministry for your generation, and you need to get your hands dirty trying to pull it off. But if you are, how do I say this, in advance of those generations, where your 40s are maybe in the rearview mirror, you don't get to do this. You don't get to just drop the ball on their plate and say, here, take this, I'm done with it. No. A vital question for you is this. How are you now investing in us? See what I did there? I said us like I fit in with that younger group, right? The Apostle Paul did not hand Timothy the keys to the church and say, hey, good luck with that, have fun. Rather, the Apostle Paul, he passed the baton, running a few steps together with him so that the handoff was smooth and Timothy could get his full legs under himself. Those with wisdom and experience need to ask themselves, what do I know about Christ and His church? And how do I pass that on to the next generation of leaders? For me, that was the tone of General Conference. And just like General Conference, we're short on answers. And we're short on how-to models. But we know we're up against something. And each of us is called to play a part. But we play that part in confidence that we are called by the one who not only went to the cross and went to the grave, but the one who was resurrected from it. And if He has power to do that, then He has power to do whatever He dreams next. So let us remember that time by sharing in communion together.